All right, everyone, welcome back. This is The End of the World with Michael and Stu.
I'm Michael.
And I'm Stu, and today we are talking about the Cuban Missile Crisis in all of its glory, both real and, at least for a little bit, fictionally reimagined. Through the lens of who else? Our favorite avatar of destruction, Kevin Costner. This time, in his biggest stretch of a role, playing a Bostonian.
Yeah, a truly horrific accent. Sort of
Yeah,
like
just
I prefer it when they just bail on it, like Richard Gere in was that King Arthur? What was it? First Night,
oh yeah, yeah.
where they're just like, "Fuck it, this guy cannot do an English accent. Just use your normal voice. Who gives a shit?"
Yeah, it's funny how Americans, because American English has become the kind of default accent of the world, have just kind of become the worst at
Yeah,
accents, like as actors. Like English, a lot of English actors can do American passably well. Although, of course, you know who does the best American accent of all British actors?
no,
Hugh
Hugh
Laurie.
Laurie. Yeah,
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 House. You do not think for a second that House might be
yeah.
English,
I should have
and
gotten.
yet, and yet he is. He is very English. In
We
any
should do House.
case,
We should do House at some
the
point.
end of the world. Yeah, I mean, it's every episode of that show is the end of someone's world,
It's the end of some world,
until
right?
the intervention of the modern Sherlock Holmes, Doctor
And
House.
Wilson's world. It's also the end of Wilson's world every episode.
Ah, well, poor long-suffering Wilson. I once saw him on the subway. Real thrilling moment in my life.
In
Will
character or the
No,
actor?
the actor. I was like, damn, that's Robert Sean Leonard, and I screamed. No. Yeah. So before we get into the deep, dark history of the American, Cuban, Soviet triangulation of the early 1960s,
Yeah.
I guess my book,
Yes, we have some exciting news on the
my
podcast. We
book,
have a real life plug that Stu is going to give
yeah,
now.
my book, Fernsehturm Berlin, is coming out today on the day of this podcast launch, which is to say April 30th, 2024. And it's my second full length poetry collection about which I am quite excited. I first started working on this book, I think, gosh, maybe in 2015 or 2016. And, knowing the ins and the outs of the publishing industry, it's now 8 years later, and the book has finally come to press. And it's with Broken Sleep Books in the UK. Very excited, very cool press. And yeah, it's a good book. It touches on a lot of the themes that we've touched on in the pod. A lot of stuff about plagues, nuclear war,
Oh,
uh,
good.
Berlin. You
A
know,
light read. A light read.
yeah, it's very funny though. It's quite dark. There's also a big subplot about Princess Diana and her death. Was it a conspiracy? Elton
Is it
John
is it
appears.
similar in tone to your previous book? Was it Communicating Groups? Is that
Yeah,
right?
Communicating Groups is my first book. It's similar in style to
Okay.
my first book, which is to say that when you hear poetry book, you probably are picturing, a bunch of like short lines on the left side of the page going down
Right. With
evenly.
with titles like Thursday, 10:15 a.m. So
Yeah, it's not like that. There's no titles. The whole book is the poem. And there's
Communicating Groups, I can't stump for. Great book and just like you're saying, extremely funny in places.
yeah, yeah, it's similar to that in tone. Communicating Groups is more about the confluence of serial murderers and political leaders. How there's a suspicious overlap between those two groups. And then when you look back in like myth and legend, people like Caesar, the legend of King Arthur, a lot of the things that that really qualify them to be our leaders are the number of people that they have slain. and
Sure.
then and then in our modern culture we sort of venerate these, even if we don't venerate, all true crime podcasts are very clear to let you know that they're on the side actually of the victims. This is not a podcast where we celebrate these abhorrent acts.
Or glorify in any way.
No, no, but we will make money off
Yeah.
talking exclusively about the most gruesome material in the world. But who are we to talk? Look, we're doing a podcast about the end of
I
not
mean,
just a single
stuff like
life or
Water
us.
World and Al Gore. I mean, we're not.
Okay, yeah, Al Gore. Well,
Yeah, fair enough.
one could argue that Al
Bad
Gore
example.
is perhaps more evil than even Ted Bundy, or I don't know. Depends on your take on Mr. Gore. Yeah, but this new book is less about that. It's more a mix of memoir. A lot of stuff is about my time living in Berlin back
Oh, cool.
in gosh, when was it? 2002. During college, I spent a summer there studying German and just kind of hanging out. And I was miserable, but not because of the city, just because of my, 20, 21, that age. Not a great time in one's life, generally speaking. Of course, we often look back on that period with nostalgia. This is not exactly that. But I went back to Berlin a couple times in more recent years to just kind of wrestle with ghosts. So there's another big subplot about Hamlet, um, the idea of like inheritance and who you are, what does it mean to act, and
Right.
then there's a lot of stuff about the moon landing. Was it fake?
Which I'm sure is an episode at some point.
Well, you know, I hope
We'll find
so.
a way.
We'll find a way. Was the moon landing fake? I tend to say no, it was not fake actually, but I do love the idea
That's
of.
correct. But we haven't done our research on it yet, so.
Well, I have actually.
Oh,
I've
sure.
done
Right.
enormous amounts of
The book.
research. It's not fake. Um, but I just love the idea that it was fake. Like just getting together and being like, all right, here's the plan.
Yeah. Was it Kubrick? Was that the idea?
That's a very recent permutation of the moon landing is fake. There's actually many ways you can verify that it was not fake, even here from here on Earth.
Hmm.
They
That's
left
too.
they left this thing on the Earth on the moon that you can see through a you have the right telescope. Never mind, it's not fake.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, from those NASA telescopes, you can see it.
right, and I mean like so I don't know. I'm excited about the book. It's always weird promoting a poetry book on some level because the audience for poetry is quite limited, and when you
Mhm.
tell people that you've written a poetry book, there's this sort of this kind of pallor, this
Right. So
ashenness goes over their face.
you often have to lead with like, "Oh, I'm releasing a book," and then you have to be like, "It's poetry." After, like, you have to get the initial excitement of the book release, and then drill
Yeah,
down
I think
and
that's right. And in my
candidly
case,
announce that
the
it's
book is
fact poetry.
genuinely crazy enough that it doesn't even really feel like a poetry book. There are some
Yeah.
sections of it, though, I will say, that are in rhyme. There's some metered sections in rhyme, but it's not presented. For the most part, it's presented in large blocks of text, and then there's some parts where I play with font size in this book, which is something I didn't do in the first book. But I think it's pretty funny. I mean, there's this part about Princess Diana. I'm like imagining if her death was not even a conspiracy, but was in fact a suicide. And it's like she's like, driver, slam the car at 90 miles an hour into the seventh, pedestal of this underground tunnel we're going through.
Yeah.
The driver's just like, oui, madame. It's just like,
For Queen Country.
yeah, I mean, so I don't know. I'm excited about it. You can
Right.
check it out. I'll post a link on the Instagram, which you should follow. End of the World WMS. And yeah, I'll let you guys know if there's any exciting events coming up in an area near you. I know we have. I might be going out to California. Might be going to Germany. And we have some listeners in both those places. So stay tuned. But it actually this kind of segues nicely because one of the big themes of the book is the Cold War and the sort of long aftermath of World War II, which is kind of where we find ourselves today with the, as I call it, the crisis, uh, the CMC, uh, which that's what the cool kids are calling it these days,
Yeah.
the CMC. Um, you got any personal history with the CMC, with the Cuban Missile Crisis? Like for me, it was always kind of this thing that my parents would talk about as like
Right. That's right.
the scariest moment of their lives. I mean, my parents were pretty young when this happened. My parents are quite close to me in age, so I think they were. My dad was like 5, but I remember distinctly at some point when I was probably not much older than 5, asking my dad like, in your opinion, who's the best U.S. president of your lifetime or something? And he said, I think John F. Kennedy, just because, he kept us from becoming, cinders in the,
Yeah, I guess like all things being equal, that could tilt it.
it's a good, it is a good achievement that he managed to have us not be annihilated.
Made it so not everybody died right
Yeah,
away.
yeah, that was a plus. Yeah, I'm not the biggest Kennedy stan, and I find, as we'll discuss a little later, I find the people that act as if Kennedy had lived, we would have avoided so many horrors and life would be so much. I don't,
Well, and that everything, yeah, everything would have worked out.
yeah, I don't believe that at all. Actually, I think that's
No,
very
I don't have any real sense of it from the perspective of like my parents were, I guess, like a little older than that, but not by much. And so
right.
like probably existed in their minds as sort of a, I mean, especially for my mother, who I guess was less than under 10 years old living
Yeah,
in the Northeast, that it's just kind of like a, it's like
and your
a
dad would
ghost.
have been in the UK still at this
Yeah.
point.
It feels like for someone like my mom, it's almost like probably like a ghost story, like
Yeah,
you're not processing it at any real level, but rather like maybe not taking it seriously enough or taking it far too seriously in the sense of like thinking you're going to die, which I imagine is how I would have felt at 9 years old if I had been around. But yeah, I think by the time that we started talking to our parents about politics, the Cuban Missile Crisis had already been relegated to almost like a legend more than something that's like the fall of the wall, which
yeah,
is was still in the political consciousness and mainframe. In fact, like I think there was a general notion that like that in the time that had passed the 30 years or whatever, that the possibility of nuclear war had become exceedingly unlikely, and this was actually kind of one of the achievements of the modern, you know, geopolitical structure.
yeah. Um, I don't know. I felt like growing up in the 80s and early 90s, I still thought about nuclear war far too often, as I've mentioned on the pod before. I think mostly because of Terminator 2, right? Just the what's that? The Skynet of it all.
Yeah, exactly.
One of the main motivators behind us doing this pod, I would say, ultimately,
Absolutely.
it's Skynet. It's looming shadow. But let's get into the Cuban Missile Crisis. So Cuba in the 50s was a dictatorship backed by the U.S., United Fruit Corporation. A lot of big business interests had a lot of money in Cuba. The mafia, famously, as depicted in Godfather 2, very influential. And it turns out the Cuban people not so crazy about this. An exploited underclass that was not given any piece of the pie, so to speak.
Mhm.
So from 53 to 59, the famous story of the Castro brothers and their kind of ragtag band of revolutionaries who had been in exile, come back to Cuba, started out just a couple guerrillas in the mountains, and by New Year's Day, 1959, they successfully oust Fulgencio Batista, who is the U.S.-backed dictator. And it's not clear initially that like they're going to be communists. Like they weren't overtly communists at that point. It's
Right.
only when they start basically nationalizing and kicking out big U.S. business interests that sort of enmity with the United States really develops. And
Are they describing themselves as communists before they turned to the Soviet Union to seek support?
not, I mean, to my knowledge, that becomes a bigger part of the story a little bit later on. Once, especially particularly after the Bay of Pigs, which we'll talk about in just a second, right? I mean, uh, once it becomes clear that the U.S. is like not going to deal with them at all, and is in fact going to put an embargo on Cuba and not do any trading business and not allow tourism of any kind, I think they turned to the Soviets kind of just out of pragmatic necessity because they were the only. This is like a bipolar world, right? The United
Yeah.
States hates you, and you need international support, as Cuba very much did at this time. Um, there's only one place to go, right? China still developing, still mostly for the most part in the Soviet sphere of influence at this time, although tensions are already emerging between those two powers. So you need If you
So
need,
how does Russia, but or sorry, how does the Soviet Union see Castro and Cuba in this phase?
just a useful satellite.
Yeah.
There have been several other failed um, communist slash socialist revolutions in different parts of Central America up till this point. Guatemala was brutally put down by the CIA in the 1950s. That they'd had a kind of left leaning government takeover, which the U.S. was essentially not allowing any even left leaning governments to
Mhm.
gain power in Central and South America at this time. Basically, using the Monroe Doctrine to say, like, this is our sphere of influence, and if, you know, we'll just without question kind of, do whatever it takes, including backing, brutal fascist dictators in places like Brazil, places like Argentina, places like Chile a little bit later, right? I mean, this is just like standard American policy at the time. And that's essentially what they wanted to do with Cuba too. Once Batista was out, they wanted to put someone like him back in as soon as possible. And the first thing to do if you want to achieve that is get rid of Castro, right? So the Bay of Pigs invasion is a plan that's actually developed under Eisenhower in 1960, 61, and it only goes into effect in early 61 in April, just after Kennedy has become president, just a few months into his presidency. He's aware of it. He's not the one who planned it, but he trusts the so-called deep state advisors, people like the Dulles brothers, or particularly Alan Dulles at this point. I think John Foster Dulles may have already been off the scene at this point, but never mind. The Dulles brothers are like these good old boys, Yaley CIA freaks, right?
Mhm.
And they assured him that like this is all well thought out. We're gonna take out Castro, and the Bay of Pigs is
It's gonna
total.
work, no problem, Jack.
Yeah, yeah, Jack. Don't think about it. It's just say yes. Just do. And it's a
I
really
mean, to me, the tell if I'm Kennedy, the tell is the name. The Bay of Pigs invasion just sounds like something that has to go wrong. It's like just the sound of if someone told me like there was an invasion at the Bay of Pigs, we call it the Bay of Pigs invasion, I would say that must have failed. That
let,
sounds like it.
let's rethink this. Is there a nicer sounding bay we could
Right,
possibly
right.
invade? Right, and the Bay of Pigs is this swamp on the southern part of Cuba, and I forget. I think the 1400 right wing Cuban guerrillas were training in I think Guatemala and Nicaragua, and they were going to have cover from these World War II era bomber planes
Right.
that the CIA had painted to be like Cuban Air Force. It's like the whole thing's like really not that well executed. And they're
Why the Bay of Pigs? Why choose a swamp?
well, because I think they probably surprise like if America attacks, it's going to be from Miami. It's going to be from the
Right,
north. But oh my God, it's from the south. Whoa,
right.
what can we do? Nothing. We're doomed. And I think there was also a really bad misconception of the level of uh, hatred for Castro among the people in Cuba, right? Just there was an assumption that if these Cuban guerrillas with CIA support land, the people will rally to them because they're sick of Castro
Do
and they'll
you
throw them
think
out.
that that was a genuine assessment of the intelligence community, or was that just
Absolutely. Yeah.
really?
I mean, I think
Wow.
the intelligence community is very imperfect and
Yeah.
filled with maniacs, who are just like, who are probably like not even capable of imagining why
But there's a
anyone
there's
would
a sense
support
then that
Castro.
to come to that conclusion, they're just hearing what they want to hear from who they want to hear it from.
Absolutely. And I mean, the people from Cuba who are talking to them are the people that left Cuba or were expelled from Cuba, right? So it's like, it's a feedback loop of bad
They're like, oh, my
information.
cousin, he's going to be with you for sure.
Yeah.
You go,
Like, no, I
my
mean,
cousin John is just ready to roll.
your cousin Juan, perhaps? Yeah,
Juan,
yeah,
right.
yeah. Yeah, exactly. And this bombing raid that they launch is a disaster. They totally fail to take out any of the targets.
Mhm.
The guerrillas land on April 17th. I think it's an army of around 1,400. And within a couple days, 1,200 of those people are dead or captured. because
Sure.
Castro brings an army of 50,000 people, or like an actual army comes
Right.
and just defeats them immediately, and it's a disaster. The CIA slash Strategic Air Command are really pushing on Kennedy to just have the Air Force just bomb the hell out of Cuba in support of this invasion. And Kennedy doesn't. He famously does not do that. It says this is a disaster. Clearly, that's not going to be enough to save them. And this is one of the big things people point to as why the deep state allegedly had Kennedy assassinated. A claim that I'm quite dubious regarding. Um,
Really?
yeah, I don't believe that. I don't think that's what happened. Um,
And
but
yet you think the moon landing is real.
exactly. I am a shill for the deep state, as I've been told many times. It's extremely embarrassing. This is a new president, and this helps to give the image to the Russians that Kennedy is incompetent, that Kennedy is unwilling to make the big moves when it comes to dealing with situations that are, like that he's a lightweight, essentially.
So is there an argument that if he had taken a, let's say, stronger approach, that Khrushchev and the Soviets are less likely to move? Like, let's assume that the approach doesn't lead to a full scale invasion and overthrow of Castro.
But they bomb heavily,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
maybe
It,
it's hard to
so, like,
say.
is there any argument that like what
No, I
happened
mean, I don't think
big
so because
did lead to the Cuban Missile Crisis, or
there's a couple other things that happen that contributed to the idea of Kennedy as a lightweight, though. One of which is the sort of U-2 Francis Gary Powers incident, where the U.S. was under the impression that these U-2 spy planes, which flew at
oh, I
extraordinarily.
thought you were talking about the band. I was so
No, I
confused.
think that's where the band gets its name from.
Okay,
I
sure.
don't I don't know that for certain, but I've always just assumed so. It's funny. I
Right.
was talking with my friend Jason Anderson about Bono Vox just last night. I love that part. That the full name of Bono is Bono Vox, which translated from the Latin means good voice.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he's a profound thinker, a
A poet.
revolutionary, a poet.
Takes one to know one, right, Stu?
Touche. Um, but in any case, yeah, the U-2 spy planes. You're aware of them, right? They're these really high flying, very lightweight, that they fly miles up in the sky and take very precise photos with these high resolution optical cameras. And the U.S. was under the mistaken belief that they were too high, that Russians could not shoot them down. So sometime in 61, 62, during a meeting that Khrushchev and Kennedy are having, one of these impossible to shoot down planes is shot down. And what's worse, the pilot, Francis Gary Powers, is taken alive and is like paraded by the Soviets, like, look, we've got your spy, like, here he is. Eventually he's traded back to the US or whatever. But this is another incident that happens where Kennedy looks weak because, his spy guy got caught in the act. Another thing is Berlin, right? There's a big crisis over Berlin. After World War II, Germany famously split East and West. The city of Berlin, which is squarely in the center of the eastern portion of Germany, was also split. So you have Western Germany, but then you have this little capital city. It's quite a large city, but that's also split. So the West Berlin is just an enclave in a sea of Eastern Bloc communist territory. And
Right.
the Soviets hate this, obviously, because for decade, 15 years plus since the end of the war, communists have just been like going to West Berlin and being like, I don't want to go back. And West Berlin's like, great, here's a flight to Hamburg or whatever. Like you can relocate to Munich, or like, so. And I think in the course of, like, millions of people have been fleeing communism through West Berlin, which leads in the early 60s to the construction of all-time favorite landmark, the Berlin Wall, which is basically designed to prevent these people. It's a sort of stopgap to keep people from fleeing into West Berlin and escaping to the freedom-loving West. In this case, I think it was appropriate to say the Soviets really did hate us for our freedoms. But Kennedy also did not have a strong response to that, right? They built the Berlin Wall, and Kennedy didn't do anything. attack it. I mean, I think the West sensing. So Berlin is this big push point that one thing 13 Days doesn't mention. It doesn't talk about Berlin at all, which is hilarious because that was like the main other thing that was the thought was if we invade Cuba, they'll invade Berlin, and it would be a sort of tit for tat. And Kennedy didn't want that, right? He went to Berlin. He made the famous "Ich bin ein Berliner," which pedants will tell you is was him saying "I am a jelly donut," right?
Right, right, right.
Because if you're real German, you say "Ich bin Berliner," like I'm a Berliner. You don't need the you don't need the ein. But anyway,
Yeah, Kennedy was always about that flair, though, baby.
that's a great. It's a great. Even if it was a gaff, people loved it. People were
Yeah.
yeah. In any case, so yeah, Khrushchev thought that by putting missiles in Cuba, this could be a wedge where he could trade removing those missiles potentially for removing the West from Berlin. It's like giving
Huh.
up.
Yeah.
I mean, not the worst plan. I mean, a
No,
bad,
of course.
but I mean,
I mean, it allows him to put something in their sphere of influence, right? It gives him a chip that
exactly.
he's
I mean,
yeah.
that's all this is a sort of diplomatic chess match, right? Where the pieces on the board, Berlin is a big one, Cuba is another one that has recently come into the Soviet sphere, and they're going to try and use it to leverage to get what they can, which is essentially what ends up happening at the resolution of the crisis. Um,
Right. You sort of wonder why it got to the point that it got to when it was so clear in a way what the solution was going to be.
yeah, I mean, you got to remember there are hardliners who are completely insane, especially on the American side,
Mhm.
right? Who are like looking for any excuse to launch an all-out nuclear war against the Soviet Union. And
Right.
interestingly, on the other side, the Cubans, that's what they want. The Cubans, Castro, Che Guevara, Raul
Really?
Castro, they're like willing to sacrifice their entire nation to destroy the United States. They beg Khrushchev to just start a nuke.
No.
Oh yeah, we'll get to it in a little bit, but yeah,
Okay.
they what one big problem for the USSR is like putting missiles in Cuba could give them a slight advantage, but by this point they're already developing intercontinental ballistic missiles, right? So there soon enough there would be missiles launched from Russia that could reach any part of the United States. This is kind of like this is that same transition point we discussed at Doctor Strangelove, though, where there aren't there's still bombers with nuclear weapons circling in the air at all hours, right? This is on
Mhm.
both sides. There are nuclear submarines, but there is a huge missile gap. Now, one of the funny things is Kennedy hammered Nixon and the Eisenhower administration, for whom Nixon was the VP in the 60 election, on allowing a missile gap with the USSR to develop, claiming the USSR had substantially more missiles than the United States did at the time. Um, would you believe it if I told you that that was not true?
And not even close, right?
No, I mean the U.S. I think the USSR had something like 20 ICBMs, and
Sure.
the U.S. had something like I don't remember the precise number, but like thousands. like the U.S. had like 100 times as many
Yeah,
missiles.
yeah.
There's just like some staggering. There was a staggering missile gap in the other direction. Um, so from that perspective, if you could stage these slightly shorter range, but still, going 1,000 miles to blow up DC or New York or whatever
Mhm.
in Cuba, and they could be fired before the U.S. had a chance to detect them. Um, that could be a game changer, right? That could be just what the doctor ordered, so to speak. Um, but it's not really as big a game changer as I think it's made out to be. So in 1962, Castro uh, makes this deal to have these missiles. I think in the spring they make the deal. By the summer, the U.S. starts noticing more suspicious crates being on boats being unloaded, but no immediate sign that it's nuclear weapons. Right? First, it just seems defensive, conventional. But they take notice. There's U-2 spy planes flying over, taking pictures. Uh, but eventually, there's a gap in the U-2 coverage. Partly because of weather. There was some other political reason why they basically from the beginning of September 1962 to the end of September, there were no U-2 flights. But there start to come in all these cousin Juan and his buddies start telling their friends in Miami, "Hey, like they're building these missiles," and the U.S. treats these reports with skepticism. Yeah, they can't. They're probably just regular missiles. They're probably not. Probably like air defense.
Last time we talked to you, you said that you were all against Castro.
like maybe they were looking with some skepticism at the intelligence they were receiving from Cuba after the Bay of Pigs. And by October 14th, U-2 flights are reauthorized. There's clear weather. To the horror of the U.S., they discover, oh my God, these reports are true. There are at least something like 40 intercontinental ballistic missiles, long-range missiles that could reach the continental U.S. with ease. And
you think that the Soviets knew that there was a gap in coverage? I mean, what incredible timing to just like.
No, I'm not doing a good job. There's a better explanation for this that I just don't have in my notes. Big source for all of this is the great book Command and Control by Eric Schlosser, once again, which I mentioned in our Strangelove episode. It's not specifically about the Cuban Missile Crisis, it's about the entire history of U.S. nuclear weapons, their uses and abuses, and covers the many, many accidents that have taken place where nuclear missile just fell off a boat. Just like fell off the side of the aircraft carrier with a plane attached to it. Just like a wave hit.
Oh, you're being serious?
Yeah, that happened. Yeah. And they never got the missile back. It's just at the bottom of the trench somewhere. Yeah. There's
gotta go around on holiday with one of those detectors, like looking for.
Yeah. Get James Cameron down there.
Honey, I found a nuke.
I mean, I think I mentioned this in the Strangelove app, but there are so many accidents, and so it's horrifying. But yeah, it is unfortunate timing that there was like a no overflights during this period when they actually happened to be starting to stage nuclear missiles, and the missiles were almost ready by the time we found. Like, if they rushed it, they could get them ready in like 10 days or something. So Kennedy is alerted the next day after this is confirmed. And the generals are all like, well, got no choice. We got to invade. Just like,
our hands are tied.
Yeah. Just like,
would we want a peaceful resolution with Castro and Khrushchev? Obviously. Have they forced our hand here? Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, it's like there's an amazing full court press on Kennedy to just invade, and like Curtis LeMay, who we talked about during Strangelove, bombs away LeMay, who is the craziest maniac in American history. He's just his whole dream is just like, and I mean, he was very efficient. Like, he organized the Strategic Air Command, which had control of the nuclear arms, and he trained them very well, and they were ready to go. But he really wanted to, it's like when you practice something for a really long time, but then you never have a chance to use it. And
has to be part of it, right? Is that once you're that close to it, it's like there's got to be some sort of morbid fascination in seeing the whole kit and caboodle.
Yeah, and I mean, LeMay was also just like a psychotic, right? He later ran as the vice president with George Wallace in 1968, the famous racist candidate. Who was shot during the election. And the Wallace people came to see LeMay as something of a liability on the campaign trail. The Wallace people were like, oh my God, this guy is way crazier than our Klan-loving psycho candidate.
His Sarah Palin has like a species-wide death wish.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. It's not good.
See Russia from here, says LeMay.
Yeah. So basically, like,
so LeMay wants an invasion of Cuba
and bombing, just to bomb the missile sites, invade, kill Castro, take over the island.
And just to play it out for a second, I mean, if we are confronted with the possibility, right? If we know that they have a very limited nuclear arsenal.
Well, that's what we thought. We actually,
Right.
well, but Michael, what if I told you the Cubans had tactical nuclear weapons the United States had no idea about as well?
Oh,
Tactical nuclear weapons being like nuclear
yeah, yeah.
artillery shells and like even like the little Davy Crockett's, like the nuclear
Right, but
bazooka.
there is,
So in
I
other
mean,
words, if we had
in
invaded,
terms of the war games of it all, there's some logic to a mass just destroying Cuba
right,
as soon as.
but what I'm saying is, if we had done that, they would have attacked us with nuclear weapons,
Right, but we
which
didn't
would
know that.
have escalated to us using nuclear weapons, to Russia using nuclear weapons, to
So the
So it's
Russian
really
nuclear
good that we
weapons.
didn't just do that. Is what I'm saying.
Yeah, 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 yeah. No, no, I know. I'm just thinking about the thought process. Like the Russians nukes that are not in Cuba, they obviously can have a horrific impact on Europe, but they can't reach the States. Is that right?
No, they can. Some of them can,
Some of them can. Okay, okay.
and there are also planes and submarines, right? So like, there's a lot of there's a lot of
Moving parts.
yeah,
Right, right.
exactly. Um, it would be bad. I mean, they estimated that like at least 100 million Americans would die at a time when the population was like under 200
So,
million.
so when Kennedy's
so
getting this, when Kennedy,
50% of the population.
yeah, when Kennedy's getting this early advice, is he immediately thinking he's being played by these people?
No, I think
Okay.
he understands.
With the Bay of Pigs, be like
Yeah, I
in
think
the.
he's skeptical because of that, but I also think he admits that they're probably right and that an invasion probably will be necessary. But
Mhm.
before that comes to pass, he wants to at least test out the diplomatic waters to see if this can be avoided.
And is he genuinely doing that, or is he just trying to make it look like he's doing
No,
that?
he's genuinely doing that.
Yeah.
I don't think he wanted to incinerate Cuba. Um,
Yeah.
and I think he just
He
feared.
was a special man, wasn't he?
I think just pragmatic, right? Because I think he understood
Yeah.
that that would lead to West Berlin being conquered. If West Berlin is conquered, there's real pressure to start a land war in Europe, right? Like
Mhm.
there's just all these dominoes that then start to fall where things could be totally out of control very quickly.
Yeah.
And
Almost like our destruction was mutually assured, right?
exactly, um, you know, McNamara, who's the Secretary of Defense, former head of Ford Motor Company, good buddy of JFK, was a talking head for years on PBS programs and stuff like
Mhm.
that. Um, he's pretty pragmatic about it. He's like, look, this actually doesn't change anything. We still have like 3,000 more missiles than like let's not
You're not
overreact
saying this in retrospect. This is what he said at
at
the
the
time.
time. Yeah,
Okay.
and they ultimately decide against military advice to institute a blockade to prevent further Russian armament shipments to go to
Mhm.
Cuba, right? Kennedy goes on TV and announces this. I think that's on October 22nd, so a week after the missiles are first discovered. They don't initially even tell the Russians they know about it. They play it cool. They act like everything's fine. They have normal, whatever meetings were scheduled happen, whatever, like it's kept very hush hush until Kennedy's like, this is an aggressive act by Russia. Russia lied to us. They've betrayed us, yada, yada. Um, and Kennedy says it shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union. Right? Um, so Soviets are like, oh, okay, like it got real. Like, and the Soviet Union says that the Turkish blockade, or not the Turkish, the Cuban blockade, I'm about to talk about Turkey, um, is an act of piracy by the U.S. And this is the imperialist scum.
Pirates?
Yeah, because they're like boarding Russian ships and like they're playing it up. They're being dramatic.
Yeah, yeah.
And Kennedy immediately is like, "What if we took the missiles out of Turkey?" So there are some Jupiter missiles staged in Turkey, aimed right at Moscow. He's saying, "What if we just remove those?" The Turks are like, "You better not do
And
that."
and Khrushchev wouldn't just take that at first. He wanted Berlin too.
Initially, but I think once stuff started getting real, he probably like, well, as we'll discover, like, yeah, he would have taken, and he
Right.
ultimately does take that. I mean, that is the deal. But those missiles in Turkey are already outmoded and outdated, and there are going to be newer, better missiles very soon. So it's not that big of a loss. But the Turks are a key ally and would be extremely insulted if we just engaged, if we involved them in any kind of trade publicly.
Sure.
So Kennedy really doesn't want to do that. Um, then basically, uh, this is like a real moment of escalation. Here's one of the other big things about nuclear war, which is the Singular Integrated Operational Plan, which is something that was developed in the 50s, the PSYOP. It's actually called the PSYOP, but it's not a PSYO.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
um,
Of course, they probably did that on purpose, though.
that was itself, calling it that was
Just to
also
fuck with us.
was a PSYOP. Yeah, exactly. Um, this is the thing where like it's not possible to fire some of the nuclear missiles. Do you know this? Like
Yes.
you have to fire them all.
Yep.
Like like every
I mean, it makes sense.
I mean the idea being that if a nuclear strike from the Soviets is incoming, they're probably
Right.
going to send their whole thing. So we got to send all just in case we all get blown up. Well, at least we launch these and then
Right. It's hard to, you can't plan for like a small surgical nuclear war where you're picking off spots. I mean, I guess maybe it could happen like that. Like if they're like, well,
well, it
we'll
could
take,
happen if it was like a rogue nation like North Korea or something.
right.
But
But like, couldn't Russia or the Soviets could like take out Paris and then be like, we'll get London next if you don't stop or something.
right, they can't do like a Doctor Evil like space laser unless you give us $1 million or whatever. Um, yeah, I think it is kind of crazy though that it was just nuclear war was just like an all or nothing thing, where it was like,
Right. But here's the question, like, was that the actual idea when it got close? They were talking in terms of the full thing,
yeah,
following through on like completely sending the entire or massive amounts of the arsenal directly onto the Soviet Union. Is that right?
yeah, like and triplicate. Like there'd be every target would have like 3 hydrogen bombs coming in waves. Like it wasn't like
Like, what's the peak here? What is the closest it got to
well, it's hard to
that?
pinpoint that because Khrushchev, I think, starts to have doubts as soon as things get public. And he is aware that the US has a strategic advantage in terms of the amount of nuclear weapons at
Right.
its disposal. And I think
So
he
is
is,
Khrushchev shitting his pants a bit?
I think
Do you think?
so. I
Yeah.
mean, I think Kennedy was too, though. I think they're both very
I guess if you're
aware.
just in that position, there's probably some
Some nerves.
pant shitting going on. Yeah.
You know, you're at the free throw line, it's tie game, no time on the clock, one
And if
shot
you right, and
to
if you
win.
miss, the entire world explodes.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, pretty much. Which I'm sure is how it feels for certain end of game scenarios. In any case, uh, I think Khrushchev assumed that Kennedy would roll over and
Yeah.
actually do nothing. Like he was kind of counting on Kennedy to
And
just
so
accept
you
this
think he
as the
thought
new status quo.
right? So you think he thought that it would be like, well, there's missiles in Cuba now, just like there's missiles in Turkey or wherever else, and now we will keep discussing things like Berlin
Yeah,
with this new paradigm.
exactly.
Okay.
I think that's what Khrushchev was hoping would happen.
And JFK himself left, let's say, untethered by the military and intelligence communities. Would he ever have considered that, do you think? Or he
No,
was
no, I think that was totally unacceptable.
okay.
I don't think JFK was an appeaser because right, remember JFK's dad was a famous like Hitler apologist
Yeah.
and was like Neville Chamberlain's buddy. He was the U.S. ambassador to the U.K. in the run up to World War II. And he was like, Hitler's fine, guys. Let's just give him Czechoslovakia. Who cares? He's not going to invade France. Are you crazy? Right? So people tarred Kennedy as the son of an appeaser. In fact, this comes up during the assassination because there's a guy in the Zapruder film you can see has an umbrella and
Mhm.
he's like opening it and people are like he's giving a signal to the second gunman to shoot. That guy was discovered years later and interviewed and he was like no, 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 I brought an umbrella because that was the symbol of Neville Chamberlain, and I was using it to protest his father, the Hitler appeaser.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is like so insane that it's true, right? This is a perfectly clear day. Why would someone have an umbrella?
Right, right.
He's got to be the signal guy for the assassins. He's like, no, 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 I'm not. I'm protesting his father's appeasement of Hitler. It's like, what? Okay. Like, people will tell you there's a gun in the umbrella, and he's.
Oh, really?
Oh God, Michael, you have no idea how deep this stupidity goes with JFK. There's a guy in the sewer. The assassin's in the sewer. The
Oh,
the
yeah.
the driver shot him because in one of the films you see the driver look back as Kennedy's getting shot, and they're like, "Yeah, he has a gun in his hand, and he just shot Kennedy." Like no one would have noticed the driver in the presidential limo turned around and shot the president. They just be like, "No, it was a guy in the book. It wasn't. Pay no attention to that smoking gun smell from the
Yeah,
driver."
yeah, yeah.
There's a lot of stupid stuff. And I mean, some of these conspiracy theorists are there are like 15 shooters. Like every building in Dealey Plaza has a different sniper team on it. There's a crossfire of like 100 bullets. Just
Right.
like I've seen presentations where people
That's incredible.
believe this. Yeah, we'll get into that in a bit. But so the closest call though was probably the submarine incident, where the Americans detected a Soviet submarine in the area of the like block quarantine line, right?
Mhm.
And they dropped some depth charges, not with the aim of destroying it, but just to like, hey, we're here, some kind of dummy rounds essentially.
Mhm.
And when you're deep underwater, you're out of radio contact. So the commanders of the sub who had a nuclear torpedo were like, has the war started? Like, and one of the guys was just like, let's yes, it has. Let's just shoot them with the nuclear torpedo.
Yes, in fact, it has started.
And the other guy's like, maybe not. But like, you needed two people to agree to turn the keys at the same. It was like you needed consensus to
Right.
fire off a nuclear weapon. But this other guy was like, no, we shouldn't do that. But if the other guy had been like, yeah, let's, they fire off a nuclear torpedo. By the way, nuclear torpedoes, pretty stupid. Like not that good. Like good, like regular torpedoes are good for sinking boats. There's
Yeah.
no need to like put a little hydrogen bomb in the. This is like they're literally putting nuclear bombs in like everything, right?
Right.
There's a suitcase one where it's just like a hydrogen bomb. You carry it and but there's probably not a hydrogen bomb, but an atomic bomb. The bazooka, right? The
So,
David
like,
Crockett.
while we're at this like level of escalation, are people in the States, are they going into their bomb shelters? Are they like, is it getting to?
I assume that if you had one, you were right.
Yeah,
Um,
it's amazing that that became, it's very American. It became like an industry unto itself, right? Everyone, like a ton of people were buying like materials to build bomb shelters and like
yeah,
stock,
my
it's
parents
kind of like preppers, right?
a little bit
Now,
like
yeah,
that. I think with more rationale behind it.
I would say so, yeah.
I would say, probably unlikely you're going to survive in your bomb shelter in the
Right. Well, that's the
nuclear
funny part.
wasteland very
Right.
long.
Or in
But,
your school, you're like duck and cover, and just like that should do it.
well, I think that's more of like, you know, um, placebo kind of, you know,
Right, right,
like we
right.
can do something. We're going to duck and cover,
Yeah,
like,
don't worry, kids.
it'll be fine, right?
Face the wall. The wall protects you from the nuke.
Go into your bathtub. You'll be fine.
Yeah, yeah.
My parents' house in Maine actually has a bomb shelter in its basement.
Wow.
Not like it's been repurposed. Like I think
Yeah,
my dad used it for
yeah.
like storing old. It's like a wine cellar or something now. But when we first moved up there, um, maybe 10 years ago or so, it was like, oh yeah, this is like a relic from that era. So I mean, yeah, people had them in their houses. Again, how effective are they going to be? Not very, probably.
Mm.
But again, people want to feel like they can do something. Um, yeah, I think the mood was pretty somber as all this is going on. And it's playing out relatively quickly. I mean, the movie's called 13 Days because that's how long this whole crisis lasted,
Right.
which is pretty wild, right?
Well, and the public wasn't aware for a week of that.
That's right.
Yeah.
It was only a week essentially until it was resolved, right? Basically, Khrushchev sends this letter late at night that's written by Khrushchev. It's not edited. It shows none of the signs of the normal Soviet PR, like back. It doesn't have the polish. It feels like a real, like he's emoting. He's saying, do we really? Here, I have a quote from it. He says, "Mr. President, we and you ought not now to pull on the ends of the rope in which you have tied the knot of war, because the more the two of us pull, the tighter the knot will be tied. And a moment may come when that knot will be tied so tight that even he who tied it will not have the strength to untie it. And then it will
I
be
do.
necessary to cut the knot. And what that would mean is not for me to explain to you, because you yourself understand perfectly what terrible forces our countries dispose." Right? Something about this is very sloppy and weird. This knot of war metaphor.
Right, right, right.
And
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, he's probably a little frayed himself, right?
oh
And he's
yeah, oh yeah. The
sitting
other thing
there at
is, all of
night
this.
thinking I should have just been a poet. Maybe I'll
Yeah,
try
the knot of.
myself.
Why am I not writing about the knot of war instead of tying it? Like, there's a little bit of Gordian knot energy, right? The ancient Lydian, the Gordian knot. King Midas's dad, Gordius, who's
Mhm.
mythical, tied this ox cart with this elaborate knot and said, "Whoever unties this will become king of all Asia." Hundreds of years later, Alexander comes along, and
Or in this case, Bobby Kennedy.
what's that?
Or in this case, Bobby Kennedy.
Yeah, exactly. And Alexander just takes his sword and cuts the knot. He's like, "I untied it. I'm king of Asia now."
Yeah.
You know. Or another version, Alexander doesn't untie the knot, but he unfastens the two things under it and slips the thing out. So he unties the knot by subterfuge or whatever. In any case, it's a stupid story, but I mean, it's a good story, but it's weird that he's talking about this Gordian knot that, like, we'll have to cut the knot of war, and, like, what that'll mean. It'll mean we'll all die, basically.
Right.
And they're like, huh, this is crazy. Also, this is all indirect, right? It's not like Khrushchev is calling up JFK and being like, the knot of war, the knot of, not like in Strangelove, right? It's actually like he sends a telegram to his ambassador, who then has to, like, bring it over in the middle of the night to the White House. And in other cases, it's like the publisher of this Russian paper is in Washington for a conference, and basically, like, he's friends with the publisher of the New York Times, so they, like, meet up and they pass messages. There's, like, all these indirect. Bobby Kennedy is friends with the guy. He goes and has Chinese dinner with him, and they.
It's amazing to think of how like complicated and difficult it was for these people to exchange information.
Yeah,
Yet they
that was what
put
was really
themselves
revealed.
in such like a ticking time bomb scenario.
Oh
Like
yeah, yeah. Like, what if the, like,
get on the
Telegram guy's
horn.
like, "Oh, I gotta call my wife. Hold on,"
Yeah.
like, just like.
Or something is just not delivered correctly. I
That's
mean,
right.
like,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's amazing, and that's one of the things. So eventually, he sends a second note in which he demands that all these missiles get taken out of Turkey and Italy and this and that and the other thing. JFK and his team just ignore the second note and respond to the first note, while through Bobby Kennedy's friend sending a back message that actually, yes, we will take out those missiles too, but we
That's right.
cannot publicly admit that we're making a trade because it'll piss off Turkey, our ally. And
Like when you text too angrily with someone and then you just start up again the next day, like none of it ever happened, and you just go back and like
yeah, exactly. I mean, it's like they're just going to pretend that those angry
just
texts never.
just start posting memes again to get the group chat back on side.
That's right. Exactly. Just that didn't happen. So the U.S. doesn't agree to remove anything, but they
Okay.
end up removing, like, pretty quickly after, like, this is all resolved.
So they
And
tell them they're going to, but they can't announce it,
exactly.
essentially. Okay.
And Khrushchev agrees. Also, they promise not to invade Cuba. They say, "Look, we'll leave Cuba alone." The Cubans are so
Think of
pissed.
them.
They are so angry. They are like, the Soviets have betrayed us. They have stabbed us in the back. But the problem is, they um, also need the Soviets for
Yeah.
materiel. They can't just like F you guys. So the Castros are so mad. Che Guevara is like, "Arr!" They're the other thing is the U.S. still doesn't know about all those tactical nukes that are there, right? The artillery shells and stuff. And the Soviets initially are like, Cuba, you can keep those, like, and they're gonna leave them in Cuba.
So they only knew what the U.S. knew,
They knew
right?
they knew the U.S. didn't
Only-
knew about the missiles, the long range
Right, but
missiles.
they were only negotiating based on whatever America had found.
That's
They
right.
weren't
That's right.
they weren't making a commitment to get rid of everything.
Right, and because the U.S. didn't know about this other stuff, so it wasn't part of the deal.
So
And
how did those get
well, let me tell you. Initially, the Soviets are like, "We'll just leave those to Cuba. It's fine." And then the Soviet ambassador is meeting with Castro and is so freaked out by how insane Castro is that he becomes absolutely certain that if left with Cuba, Castro will use those against Miami or America in whatever
really?
way he can. So he claims that there's a Soviet law that says we cannot leave these other, which there no such law existed. This is just complete improv.
Was
And
this true though? And would Castro have done
yes,
that?
Castro,
Really?
up until the end of the crisis, is begging Khrushchev to nuke America because it's the only, like, the revolution, you'll win, the revolution will win. Like, you just do it. Do global thermonuclear war.
Really?
Yeah, we don't care if Cuba will be destroyed. It's fine. The revolution is what matters. They're the new revolutionaries. So they have that zeal of the convert, right? And
Uh,
they're like, the revolution's worth it. Just nuke them. Just do it. The revolution will win if we nuke the
Soviets are
Americans.
like, trust us, it's not that
Yeah,
simple.
basically, the Soviets are like, yeah, like it's, and so they get the other nukes out of Cuba too that the U.S. doesn't learn about until much later,
Mhm.
and that's the end of the crisis. The funny thing is, Kennedy and Khrushchev both gave up something, right? But
Mhm.
only Khrushchev was seen publicly to have done so. So this burnishes Kennedy's reputation. People are like, Kennedy's a hero, Khrushchev's a zero. Khrushchev is
Yeah.
actually overthrown within 2 years of this happening, 1964, and replaced by a Brezhnev, right? And
And that's because they thought that he looked weak as well.
yeah, they were like, how did we get into this situation in the first place? This was stupid. We should not. This was way too risky. We shouldn't have done it. And um, everyone thinks Kennedy's a great hero, except for Curtis LeMay, who's like,
Of course.
Curtis LeMay's like, this is the greatest defeat.
Howard fuck.
This is the greatest defeat in the history of the United States. And like no one else thinks that.
That is amazing.
It's
So
like
what happened to LeMay after this?
he stays on for a couple more years and then retires and, as I said, runs for vice president with
Yeah.
George Wallace and is basically a raging psycho for the rest of his life. And I think he dies in 1990 at the age
Just
of,
always lamenting like what could have
yeah,
been
if only we had just nuked
if
them.
only we just
I mean, he
started a
dies just
global.
after the Soviet Union is in the process of, around the time the Soviet Union is in the process of collapsing. So maybe he
Mm.
like took that, with, maybe he died of joy.
I'm sure he sounds like the kind of guy who gains some real perspective on
Oh
death's
no, no, he's the worst. I mean, he's, you got to admire someone who's like that crazy, right?
So after this, um, they do establish direct communications
There's a
between
hotline, and it's not a phone line. It's a telex machine or tipex machine, whatever it
the
is.
White House
It's like an early
and
fax machine, and they test it every hour. They send one message from one message to the other, and it's just so that this kind of thing can. We don't have to go through all these intermediaries.
why like yeah like why not have that before this?
I mean, you know, I don't know.
I mean, like once you're
fear
building the
for
bomb, you
fear
think
of
you'd be like, we should be able to talk to each
Well,
other.
that's another big thing is like this, I think, leads people in Russia especially, but also in the US to sort of start thinking about maybe toning down some of this like production of like limitless nuclear missiles, right?
Mhm.
And they signed a partial test ban treaty within a year or two of this, which basically says no more atmospheric testing. We're not going to blow up bombs in the air. If we do testing, it'll be underground. And, it's like one of the first moments of detente, right? Like, where, okay, we're going to tone down this rising move
Yeah, I
towards
guess you wonder if something like this kind of had to happen to excel.
probably, right? And we'll talk later about some other near misses that happened in the 80s,
Mm.
where the stakes are much higher because then everyone has intercontinental ballistic missiles where there's no chance of them being
Right.
intercepted at all. So let's talk about 13 Days a bit as we wrap up. Like 19 or 2000, I think is when it came out.
Yeah.
It's a movie about the crisis, uh, dumbed down even from this very cursory. I mean, I was looking at CIA documents about this. I was looking at JFK library stuff. I was
Yeah.
reading Command and Control again. But this is an hour long podcast. I can't go into all the details. That's a 2.5 hour movie, by the way, torturously long.
It is long.
What was your takeaway? I remember liking it when I saw it, around when it came out. I thought it was
Yeah,
like,
I mean, I liked it because I was a a political junkie kid,
yeah,
and it just fed that. I mean, it's like, it's the same reason I love like JFK.
sure,
You know, I mean, JFK is obviously a far better movie,
yeah,
13 Days,
makes
but
makes much less sense, but it's a
right, but it
great movie.
feels it like one has a soft spot, I think, for all whatever you think about what actually happened to JFK or what your view of JFK is. Sort of a there's a soft spot for any like JFK and related content,
Oh
whether it's
yeah.
like
Oh, I love JFK. First
it's
time
just
I was in New Orleans, I got a chill walking by the office
I
where
know I did that too. Yeah.
like Oswald's office was here and this
Yeah, I
guy
love
was
that.
here, just like
He's right over there. And who's that over there?
exactly.
I mean, this movie was a pretty pathetic disaster. I mean, like they did the best though. Like when you actually break down as we have like what happens like cinematically, it's like there's like the submarine, the battle of the boats is kind of the most the act in terms of action that they can create
Yeah.
because then it just like then like a huge chunk of the movie is just like overwrought tortured Kennedy, like wrestling with his intelligence community and like
Just a
questions of
bunch of bad Boston accents.
right with Costner being like, you can't do it or you gotta do it, like just like coming down on the different sides all the time, just totally like
And
and
Costner plays Kenny O'Donnell, right? Who's
I think what's interesting though is that like it feels like a good movie could be there. I mean, I
yeah,
kind of it's the way I feel about it's similar to the way I feel about Civil War that we talked about
I
last week,
remember.
and
Yeah.
also the way I feel about Oppenheimer, where like it feels like really actually getting into the mental struggle of Kennedy, right? Like I have to imagine that he was shitting it way harder than was portrayed in this movie,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
There's no real time where it's just Kennedy. It's always Costner, the special assistant to the
Right, and
president, that
his
he
role is greatly exaggerated. Like the real
or
Kenny
amalgam.
O'Donnell was not. Yeah, like there were other. Kenny O'Donnell was an important advisor of JFK, but there were like a lot of other.
Yeah, they weren't just going to the special assistant for what to do about the impending
Well,
nuclear
there
pop.
wasn't just one of them. There were like
Yeah, that's
17 or whatever.
right.
Yeah.
But like, you don't have any scenes of him like back in his residence, like throwing shit. Like feels like it could have been like a
Just
psychological
like him
horror.
taking a golf club and just smashing
Like
stuff. Yeah, yeah.
if this guy didn't have a meltdown, then he is like a fucking sociopath. Like
Well.
sure, but like I guess I mean to say like the movie sticks within the mainframe of a like diplomatic language that like probably didn't like exist in this way like while this was going on. I mean, I'm sure that like there was back and forth, the military, the intelligence community,
Well,
all
and I
that
think
stuff.
the movie is based on Bobby Kennedy's memoir that was published posthumously about this
Sure,
time.
that was nothing but accurate.
Yeah, he wasn't a political guy. There's no reason he
Yeah,
would
exactly.
lie about anything.
But I don't know. It feels like it's not
And like
not
they
to
changed Kennedy's diary after he died about certain parts of
right.
they cut
It's
out the trade of the Jupiter missiles and Turkey
yeah,
from
right,
his
right, right.
literally from his diary. They're like, well,
That's
he's dead now.
amazing.
Give me that eraser.
But
You know?
the reason I bring up the Oppenheimer thing is it's not to I think there's a way to do these things, whether it's Kennedy's handling of that or the Cuban Missile Crisis or Oppenheimer and the building of the nuclear weapon that like doesn't have to glorify how, tortured Oppenheimer may have been,
Right.
you know, but at the same time, like could have shown it in a far more interesting way than I think the movie did. And I feel this to the extreme with 13 Days. Like it didn't seem like the only thing that should be interesting to me is the personal examination of Kennedy and the factors that were at play and the immense power that, in a sense, the closest to Oppenheimer, right? In terms of having that sense of power at your fingertips. Um, and in a way, Oppenheimer had that in terms of like the origin story, the creation of the thing.
Right.
But this
But
guy is
well, that's
not
the
a
scene in Oppenheimer with Truman, right? Where Truman's like, Mr. Oppenheimer, you didn't blow up anything. I blew up.
right, right, right. And so he's
get that
like
get that
Kennedy is
pansy
not
out of here or whatever.
Kennedy is not like dealing with a handful of bombs. Like Kennedy is dealing with the ability for the entire like the
Yeah.
planet to be fucking incinerated. And so like
Global thermal nuclear war. Yeah.
right. And so like that to me was a huge missed opportunity. It's also really funny because they clearly sunk so much of their budget into Costner, right? Which
Which you
like I
have
don't know
to. I
who the
mean, come
fuck.
on, you got to. It's Costner.
I mean, like I guess, but again, like you could
But
have
then
just
the
like
military scenes seem really chintzy. Like when they're the those U-2 pilots come, you're just like,
yeah, and like you
this
don't
looks
like
fake as hell. Like what is
Kennedy
this?
and Bobby. Like I have no idea who these people are. I just feel like
Like there was one guy from The West Wing I recognized. Like the other actors are very nameless.
yeah. I
There's
mean, I
not.
think this is like a thing that I mean, I can't cite an example off the top of my head, but it always feels like with movies, and I guess Civil War is the closest example that I can think of currently that like there's something about American political movies that like they've struggled to really confront the thing, and
Yeah.
so often,
What like
often
American politics? I mean,
right, like but like so often like the protagonist becomes this person who's fundamentally in an observational role,
yeah.
right? Like or like
Well,
the
it's like
coach
the
that broody play at the end of the game, like and that's what I feel. But the Costner character is like, yeah, sure, you can make it up, and that's obviously one of the most fictionalized part of this whole thing. But like it just becomes so boring. It's just like
yeah. I found it quite boring.
three like Northeasterners talking about how like these military guys sure really are crazy and we've really got to keep
This
our
isn't
heads.
how we did it back at Harvard, or
Yeah,
whatever.
exactly.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, I think that's pretty good for Cuban Missile Crisis. Fascinating topic,
Yeah.
terrifying, but ended all things considered pretty well. Like, you
Yeah, I
know,
mean, well, I mean, if the other thing considered was the
the
release
end
of
of life on the planet Earth.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, or at least the great reduction of human civilization.
And they
Uh,
got rid of fucking Khrushchev. So I mean,
yeah, but I mean, maybe Khrushchev was kind of good actually. Maybe he was better than that blowhard Brezhnev. You know,
yes, yeah, yeah.
hindsight being 2020. So next week, we're talking about Fallout, right?
Yeah, we're just gonna stick with we're gonna get a bit more into the
Nuclear zone, the aftermath.
potentialities of nuclear apocalypse as opposed to the reality of the near miss of this one. Yeah, I'm excited.
Yeah, I think it'll be good. And so remember to like and subscribe.
And buy Stu's book.
Oh yeah, my book.
I can't pronounce it. What's the title again?
Fernsehturm Berlin. It means television tower. It's that thing in
Okay.
the center of Berlin, yeah, in Alexanderplatz. It's like one of the iconic images of the city. And the book is kind of like switching through a lot of channels, sort of channeling the idea of television on a certain level in the form of abstract avant-garde poetry. So what else? What more do you need in life than that? Nothing. Great. Well, until next week, this has been the end of the world with Michael and Stu.
I'm Michael.
I'm Stu, and we'll see you real soon.